Hidden in the damp cellars of Ashford Keep, she was the pack's dark secret, a wolf who could not shift. They called her broken. They locked her away so the visiting Alpha King wouldn't see her disgrace. But they forgot one crucial detail. A true mate's scent cannot be caged. Gwendolyn Ashford plunged her raw, blistered hands into the basin of freezing water, scrubbing the blood out of the hunting tunics. The stone walls of the underground laundry room were slick with condensation and black mold, a far cry from the opulent tapestry-lined halls of the Upper Keep. She was 22 years old, the eldest daughter of Alpha Roderick of the Oakhaven Pack, and she was entirely, unequivocally broken. In a society where power was measured by the sharpness of one's claws and the sheer mass of one's wolf form, Gwendolyn possessed neither. Since her 18th birthday, the night she was supposed to shift under the blood moon, she had remained painfully, stubbornly human. While her peers tore through the medieval forests of the northern reaches in coats of silver and brown, Gwendolyn was left behind, racked by agonizing fevers that produced no transformation. The pack healers, led by an old mystic named Beatrice Hale, had diagnosed her with a stagnant soul. The beast inside her was dead, they claimed. She was a hollow vessel, a freak of nature. Her father, Alpha Roderick, had never forgiven her for the humiliation. Rather than banish her, which would have drawn unwanted questions from neighboring territories, he erased her. Gwendolyn was stripped of her title, her fine gowns, and her dignity. She became a ghost haunting the servants' corridors, a cautionary tale whispered among the Omegas. Tonight, the cruelty of her isolation was sharper than ever. Above her, Ashford Keep was vibrating with a frantic, terrified energy. King Gideon of the Ironhold, the Alpha King of all northern lichens, was arriving. Gideon was a legend forged in brutality and conquest. He had unified the fractured packs through sheer dominance, crushing rebellions and slaughtering the leaders of the rogue faction known as the Crimson Fang. Now, at 30 years old, the king was seeking a queen. His royal tour had brought him to Oakhaven, and Alpha Roderick was determined to secure his bloodline's supremacy by offering his second daughter, Cecilia. Cecilia was everything Gwendolyn was not. A fierce, flawless warrior with a pure silver coat, radiating the intoxicating scent of winter roses. She was the pride of Oakhaven. The heavy oak door at the top of the cellar stairs creaked open, and the heavy footfalls of leather boots descended. It was Thomas Miller, the captain of the Oakhaven Guard, carrying another bundle of stained linens. Thomas was one of the few who still looked Gwendolyn in the eye. "They're a league away, Gwen," Thomas murmured, his gruff voice laced with pity as he dropped the bundle beside her washboards. "The King's vanguard has crossed the White River Bridge. The Alpha wants to make absolutely certain you do not leave this cellar until tomorrow morning." Gwendolyn didn't look up, her knuckles white as she wrung out a heavy wool cloak. "You can tell my father he doesn't need to worry, Thomas. I have no desire to parade my dead soul in front of a tyrant." Thomas sighed, leaning against the damp stone. "It's not just your father. Cecilia has ordered the guards to lock the cellar doors from the outside once the banquet begins. She doesn't want to risk any distractions." A bitter smile touched Gwendolyn's lips. "She thinks my stench of failure will put the king off his roasted boar?" "She is terrified," Thomas corrected gently. "The king is ruthless. Word from the Blackwood territory is that he executed their Alpha for merely speaking out of turn. Oakhaven is small. If Cecilia fails to impress him, or if he senses any weakness in Roderick's house, he might absorb our lands and strip your father of his rank." "Then let them play their political games," Gwendolyn said, wiping her wet hands on her coarse burlap apron. "I am safe down here." But even as she said it, a strange, phantom ache flared in her chest. It was a sensation she had been feeling for 3 days, a tight, burning pressure beneath her ribs, right where her wolf should have been. It wasn't the dull, hollow ache of emptiness she was used to. It felt like embers cracking in a dormant hearth. "Just stay quiet, Gwen," Thomas warned, turning to head back up the stairs. "When the heavy iron lock clicks, don't panic. I will come to let you out before dawn." As the heavy door slammed shut and the loud metallic clanking of the deadbolt echoed down the stone stairwell, Gwendolyn was left in the flickering light of a single tallow candle. She sank against the cold wall, pulling her knees to her chest. Above, she heard the blare of the sounding horns. The Alpha King had arrived. The stone ceiling trembled with the collective roar of the Oakhaven pack submitting to their sovereign. Gwendolyn closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise, but the burning in her chest spiked violently. A gasp tore from her throat as a sudden, overwhelming wave of heat crashed over her. It wasn't just physical pain, it was a sensory explosion. Through feet of solid stone and earth, a scent cut through the damp mildew of the cellar. It was intoxicating, dark, and wild. The smell of ozone right before a lightning strike, mixed with crushed pine needles and rain-soaked earth. Gwendolyn clawed at her own chest, her breathing turning ragged. Her heart hammered a frantic, heavy rhythm. The dead beast inside her, the void she had carried for 4 years, suddenly thrashed. The great hall of Ashford Keep was a symphony of roaring fires, roasted meats, and nervous sycophants. Alpha Roderick sat rigid at the high table, his palms sweating against the polished oak. Beside him, Cecilia was a vision of calculated perfection, draped in crimson velvet that highlighted the pale, milky perfection of her skin. At the center of the table sat King Gideon. He was a massive man, imposing not just in physical stature but in the suffocating aura of dominance he passively projected. His hair was pitch black, swept back from a face scarred by war, and his eyes were a piercing, predatory amber. He did not smile. He barely touched his food. He watched the dancers and listened to Roderick's boastful tales of Oakhaven's wealth, with the bored, terrifying stillness of a predator waiting for an excuse to strike. Among the king's retinue sat Lord Silas Hawthorne, a wealthy nobleman from the Eastern Territories. Silas had been traveling with the king's court for a month, acting as a political advisor. He, too, watched the room, though his eyes darted nervously toward the shadowed archways of the hall. "Your Majesty," Cecilia purred, leaning closer to Gideon, ensuring the neckline of her dress dipped perfectly. "If it pleases you, I would be honored to show you the moonlit gardens. The frost bloom is in season, a rare sight in these parts." Gideon slowly turned his amber gaze to her. Cecilia swallowed hard, her inner wolf whimpering in submission just from the eye contact. "I have seen enough flowers, Lady Cecilia." Gideon's voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. "I came to Oakhaven seeking strength. Your borders to the north are porous. The Crimson Fang rogues have been sighted less than 10 miles from this very keep." Roderick interjected quickly. "We have tripled our patrols, my king. The rogues will not dare cross into our lands." Gideon picked up his silver goblet, about to deliver a scathing reprimand regarding Roderick's incompetence, when he froze. The goblet slipped from his massive hand, clattering against the heavy wooden table and spilling dark wine across the white linens. The entire hall fell dead silent. The music stopped abruptly. Every eye turned to the Alpha King. Gideon wasn't looking at Roderick. He wasn't looking at Cecilia. He was staring blindly at the solid stone floor. His nostrils flared. His chest heaved as a feral, deafening growl began to vibrate in his throat. It was a sound that made hardened warriors in the room take a step back in primal terror. His inner wolf, a violent, uncontrollable beast that Gideon usually kept chained behind walls of iron will, was suddenly clawing frantically at his mind, screaming a single, impossible word: "Mate." The scent was faint, buried under the stench of roasting garlic, stale wine, and the overpowering, cloying smell of Cecilia's winter rose perfume. But it was there: wild honey, ancient amber, and rain. It was the sweetest, most maddening scent Gideon had ever encountered in his 3 decades of life. He stood up so violently that his heavy, carved oak chair tipped over and crashed backward. "Your Majesty?" Roderick stammered, terrified he had somehow offended the king. Is the wine poisoned?" Gideon ignored him. His amber eyes had bled entirely black, the sign of his lichen breaking through to the surface. He stepped down from the dais, his boots thudding against the stone. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, people pressing themselves against the walls to escape his path. He followed the scent. It led him out of the great hall, past the terrified servants in the adjoining corridors, and toward the servants' quarters. "My king, please!" Roderick shouted, chasing after him with Cecilia and a dozen guards trailing behind. "Where are you going? The kitchens are not fit for—" "Silence!" Gideon roared, a command infused with so much alpha power that Roderick actually dropped to his knees, clutching his ears. Gideon reached the end of the servants' hall. The scent was pouring out from the cracks of a heavy oak door bound in iron. A heavy deadbolt was locked across the outside. Trapped. They have her trapped. A murderous rage eclipsed Gideon's mind. He didn't bother asking for the key. He raised his heavy boot and kicked the door right at the lock. The iron shattered, the thick wood splintering inward with a deafening crash that echoed up the stone stairwell. Gideon descended into the freezing, damp gloom. The air down here was thick with mold, but the scent of wild honey and rain was overwhelming now. At the bottom of the stairs, huddled against the far wall by a basin of dirty water, was a girl. She was dressed in rags, her hands raw and red, her face pale and streaked with dirt. But as she looked up at him, her wide, terrified eyes locked with his. The collision of their gazes was visceral. The air in the cellar seemed to ignite. Gwendolyn gasped, clutching her chest as the burning sensation inside her exploded into a blinding white light. For the first time in her life, she felt a massive, powerful presence awaken in the dark corners of her mind. "Mine!" Gideon rumbled, the word tearing from his throat. The King of the North fell to his knees in the dirty water, uncaring of his velvet cloak, and reached a trembling hand toward her face. Before his fingers could graze her cheek, the sound of rushing footsteps filled the stairwell. Roderick, Cecilia, and Lord Silas Hawthorne burst into the cellar, followed by the royal guard. "What is the meaning of this?" Roderick gasped, taking in the scene. When he saw Gideon kneeling before his disgraced daughter, his face contorted in a mix of horror and outrage. "Your Majesty, get away from her! She is a defective! She is a broken mutt who cannot even shift. She carries the sickness of a dead soul." Gideon stood slowly, placing himself firmly between Gwendolyn and her father. The black in his eyes was swirling with absolute lethality. "Speak of my mate that way again, Roderick, and I will tear your tongue from your throat." The word hit the room like a physical blow. Cecilia let out a strangled shriek. "Might! No, she is a cripple, a freak!" But the shock of the revelation provided the perfect cover for a sinister distraction. In the chaotic shadows near the stairwell, Lord Silas Hawthorne saw his opportunity. Silas had long been secretly funded by the Crimson Fang. His mission was to assassinate the Alpha King when he was most vulnerable, paving the way for the rogues to sweep across the Northern Territories. With all eyes glued to the shocking scene between the king and the broken girl, Silas silently slipped a dagger from his sleeve. The blade dripped with black wolfsbane, a poison fatal even to a lichen king. Silas lunged from the shadows, aiming the dagger directly at the unprotected back of Gideon's neck. "Gideon!" The name tore from Gwendolyn's lips before she even realized she knew it. It wasn't human instinct that moved her. It was the ancient, slumbering thing inside her that had just violently woken up. In a fraction of a second, the impossible happened. A shockwave of pure, blinding white energy erupted from Gwendolyn's frail body. It wasn't a physical shift into a wolf, it was a manifestation of raw, kinetic spirit. The concussive force of her sudden aura slammed into Silas midair, throwing the nobleman backward with the force of a battering ram. Silas crashed into the stone wall with a sickening crunch, the poisoned dagger clattering harmlessly to the floor. The cellar fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The guards drew their swords, staring at the groaning, defeated assassin, and then turned their terrified eyes back to Gwendolyn. She stood trembling, glowing with a faint, ethereal silver light that slowly began to fade back into her skin. She wasn't broken. She wasn't dead inside. Gideon looked from the poisoned blade to the girl in rags who had just saved his life, with a power he had only read about in ancient, forbidden texts. He turned back to Roderick, whose jaw was unhinged in absolute shock. "Pack your daughter's belongings," Gideon commanded softly, though the menace in his voice left no room for debate. "Though I doubt she has anything of value in this dungeon. Gwendolyn leaves with me tonight." The journey to Ironhold was a blur of biting winter winds and the overwhelming, terrifying reality of freedom. For 4 years, Gwendolyn's entire world had been confined to a damp, mold-infested cellar measuring 10 paces across. Now, she was wrapped in the Alpha King's personal mantle, a heavy cloak of black bear fur that smelled intoxicatingly of wild honey and rain, riding in a royal carriage flanked by 100 heavily armored lichen guards. Gideon sat across from her. Despite his massive, intimidating frame and the blood-soaked reputation that preceded him, the Alpha King was shockingly still. He did not crowd her. He recognized the trauma etched into the flinch of her shoulders and the way she compulsively hid her raw, blistered hands beneath the furs. When a sudden jolt of the carriage over the frozen mountain pass caused a lantern to clatter, Gwendolyn gasped, shrinking back into the velvet cushions with her arms raised protectively. Gideon's amber eyes softened, carrying a profound sorrow that seemed completely at odds with his ruthless public persona. "You are safe, Gwendolyn," he murmured, his deep baritone rumbling with a gentle, grounding vibration. "No door will ever be locked against you in my territory. No one will ever raise a hand to you. You have my word as king, and my vow as your mate." Gwendolyn studied his scarred face, the flickering lantern light casting long shadows across his jaw. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from years of disuse. "You saw me. I am nothing. I have no wolf. The power I showed in the cellar, I don't know what it was. It felt like a fever dream. If your court expects a warrior queen, they will be as disappointed as my father was." A dark, lethal shadow passed over Gideon's face at the mention of Alpha Roderick. "Your father is a fool who could not recognize a diamond because it was not shaped like a sword," Gideon replied fiercely. "When we reach Ironhold, my head healer, Penelope, will examine you. You are not broken, Gwendolyn. The energy you unleashed to save my life from Lord Silas, that was not a fluke. It was ancient." Ironhold was a terrifyingly magnificent fortress carved directly into the side of the jagged Black Peak Mountains. Unlike the decorative, tapestry-draped halls of Oakhaven, Ironhold was built for war. Its walls were impenetrable black granite, its watchtowers piercing the stormy sky. Yet, when the carriage doors opened, the reception was not one of cold militarism. Hundreds of pack members lined the courtyard. They did not look at Gwendolyn with the disgust and pity she was accustomed to. They looked at her with awe. The news of how she had single-handedly blasted a fully grown, armed lichen assassin across a room with pure energy had spread faster than wildfire. As Gideon offered his hand to help her step down, Captain Arthur, a towering, grizzled veteran missing his left eye, stepped forward and immediately dropped to one knee in the snow. "My queen!" Arthur barked, pressing his fist to his heart. In a cascading wave of rustling leather and clanking steel, the entire courtyard followed suit, kneeling before the girl in servant's rags. For the first time in her life, Gwendolyn wept not from sorrow, but from a profound, terrifying sense of belonging. Over the next 2 weeks, Ironhold became a sanctuary of healing. Penelope, a warm, no-nonsense older woman, treated Gwendolyn's malnutrition and the deep-seated infections in her skin. She fed her rich broths, bathed her in warm, scented oils, and slowly coaxed the shadows from her eyes. It was during a thorough examination in the royal archives that the truth of Gwendolyn's condition was finally uncovered. Penelope had brought in Maester William, a blind, elderly historian who knew the bloodlines of the Northern Territories better than anyone alive. After hovering his trembling hands over Gwendolyn's chest and feeling the intense, thrumming vibration of her core, Maester William fell to his knees, weeping. "The ether," the old man choked out, kissing the hem of Gwendolyn's gown. "The legends are true. Your Majesty, she is not broken. She is an aether wolf." Gideon, who rarely left Gwendolyn's side, stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Explain, William." "Before the lichens divided into packs, before we relied solely on tooth and claw, the moon goddess gifted her magic directly to her high priestesses," William explained, his voice trembling with reverence. "They did not shift into beasts of flesh and bone. Their souls were too immense, too saturated with raw kinetic magic. They shifted into spirit. They were the bridge between the physical world and the ancestral realm. The process of holding that much power makes the human vessel violently ill during their adolescent years, hence the agonizing fevers Gwendolyn suffered on her 18th birthday. Oakhaven's healers were ignorant. They mistook the incubation of a god-tier power for a dead soul." Gwendolyn looked at her hands. The blisters had healed, replaced by a faint, pearlescent glow that pulsed just beneath the surface of her skin whenever her heart rate increased. She wasn't an omega. She wasn't a defect. She was a living weapon of the goddess. But peace in the Northern Territories was a fragile illusion. Later that evening, the heavy oak doors of the war room slammed open. Captain Arthur stormed in, his face pale, holding a blood-soaked scroll. "My king," Arthur panted. "The Crimson Fang, they have mobilized. They are marching on Ironhold." Gideon's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "The snows are 10 feet deep in the lower valleys. No army can march through the Bloodhorn Pass this time of year without a local guide." "That is the problem, sire." Arthur gritted his teeth, glancing apologetically at Gwendolyn. "They have a guide. A faction of Oakhaven has defected to the rogues. Lady Cecilia is leading them. She has struck a bargain with Richard, the rogue Alpha. In exchange for the throne of Ironhold, Richard has promised Cecilia that she will personally get to execute her sister and claim you as her mate." The temperature in the room plummeted as Gideon's killing intent suffocated the air. But beside him, Gwendolyn did not cower. The timid, broken girl from the cellar was gone. In her place, the ether stirred, causing the very stone beneath her feet to hum with lethal, blinding power. The siege of Ironhold began at twilight beneath a bruised, snow-heavy sky. Below the black granite walls, the valley swarmed with thousands of feral, scarred rogue lichens from the Crimson Fang. At their vanguard stood Richard, a grotesque brute matted with dried blood. Beside him, in her pristine silver wolf form, was Cecilia. From the high battlements, Gwendolyn looked down at the sister who had locked her in the dark. Beside her, Gideon stood fully armored, his amber eyes burning with calm fury. "Stay within the inner keep," Gideon commanded, framing her face with his calloused hands. "I am going to end Richard, and mount your father and sister's heads on the gates." Gwendolyn placed her hands over his, a faint silver glow pulsing into his armor. "No, Gideon," she replied, her voice echoing with an ancient dual resonance. "I spent 4 years hiding in the dark. I will never hide again. These are my people." Rogue warhorns shattered the night as flaming boulders crashed against Ironhold's gates. Gideon shifted instantly into a monstrous, pitch-black wolf. With a deafening roar, the Alpha King leapt from the battlements, plunging into the heart of the rogue army. He tore through the Crimson Fang like a scythe, Ironhold warriors pouring out behind him. Yet, Richard's amassed forces were overwhelming, and the sheer volume of bodies began pressing the defenders back. Amidst the chaos, Cecilia slipped through the front line. Driven by psychotic jealousy, she bounded up the stone stairs, slaughtering archers in her path. Reverting to her human form, her crimson cloak stained with gore, an unhinged smile stretched across her face. "I told Father you were a curse," Cecilia screamed, drawing a serrated hunting blade. "He was supposed to choose me. I am perfection, and you are just a broken cellar rat." Cecilia lunged, the blade aimed at Gwendolyn's heart. Gwendolyn didn't flinch. She simply closed her eyes and let go of the dam inside her mind. The explosion of energy was catastrophic. A shockwave of pure starlight erupted from Gwendolyn, throwing Cecilia backward into the parapet wall. The dark sky split open as a massive beam of moonlight struck her. Down in the valley, the battleground to a horrified halt. From the blinding pillar of light emerged a creature of myth. Gwendolyn had shifted into a colossal, ethereal wolf, composed of swirling silver magic and crackling lightning. She was a living constellation. The ether wolf leaped from the battlements, bounding on invisible platforms of kinetic energy, landing in the battlefield's center with a concussive force that leveled 100 rogues. From the wall, Cecilia looked down in mind-shattering terror. The sister she had tormented was a god. Gwendolyn unleashed a sweeping wave of spirit energy that washed over the rogue army. Rather than killing, the light severed their unnatural blood ties, purging the madness from their minds. Hundreds of rogues collapsed, weeping as their alpha's psychological poison burned away. Richard charged at Gwendolyn in suicidal rage, but Gideon's black wolf intercepted him. With a brutal crunch, Gideon snapped Richard's neck, dropping the dead rogue at Gwendolyn's glowing paws. The remaining rogues instantly dropped to their bellies in absolute submission. 2 days later, Gwendolyn sat on Ironhold's obsidian throne beside Gideon, crowned in forged iron and moonstones. Before the dais, bound in heavy chains, kneeled Roderick and Cecilia. Roderick looked like a broken old man. Cecilia shivered, sobbing uncontrollably. "You committed high treason," Gideon's voice boomed. "The penalty is death." "Mercy!" Roderick wept. "Please, Gwen, tell him I am your father." Gwendolyn looked down at the man who had erased her existence. She felt no anger, only profound pity. "You are not my father, Roderick," she said, her voice carrying the ether's resonance. "You are simply the warden of the prison I survived." She turned to Gideon with a merciful nod. He understood. He would not taint her reign with their blood. "I strip you both of your wolves," Gwendolyn decreed. "You will live out your days as ordinary humans, exiled beyond the White River. If you return, you will be hunted." Cecilia screamed as Gwendolyn raised a hand. A flash of silver light struck the prisoners. They convulsed as their wolves were permanently severed from their souls, then were dragged from the hall truly broken. Gideon pulled Gwendolyn flush against his chest, kissing her head, his amber eyes glowing with immense pride. The court erupted into deafening cheers, howling into the vaulted ceilings. They were not cheering for a warlord today. They were cheering for the girl who had walked out of the dark, embraced her scars, and bathed their kingdom in starlight. True strength is rarely found in the loudest roar or the sharpest claws. Often, it incubates in the darkest, most oppressive sellers of our lives. Gwendolyn's journey from a discarded, abused outcast to a sovereign of mythic power proves that our deepest traumas do not break us, they forge us. When the world demands you shrink to fit their mold, dare to step into the light and shatter it.